Welcome, my friends, to the 2020 virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival, or as we call it, the VGBF. I'm Phil Kaminsky, your VGBF host, and we can't thank you enough for being part of this evening's presentation, and it's going to be a magnificent one. Nothing would make us happier than to host you in person this year, but we are so happy that you're with us virtually tonight. Before we head into tonight's main event, I ask you to do 3 things for us. First, please like this video. Second, leave a comment below to let us know where you're watching us from. And third, please hit the subscribe bell so that we can notify you about all of our latest presentations. Most certainly you're going to have questions during the presentation, and that's outstanding. Please post them in the chat. Most of them, if not all, will be relayed to the authors and will be answered following their presentation. Also, we encourage you to support tonight's talented authors by purchasing their books through our festival partner, independent bookseller Politics and Prose. And this presentation could not be possible without help from our generous featured sponsors, the David and Mikel Blair Family Foundation, Downtown Crown RPAI, and Montgomery College. Okay, let's get started. Tonight, we have Ruth Marcus, who is here to talk with us about her book, Supreme Ambition, Brett Kavanaugh and the Conservative Takeover. The Republicans began plotting their takeover of the Supreme Court 30 years ago. Brett Kavanaugh set his sights on the court right out of law school. Washington Post journalist and legal expert Ruth Marcus goes behind the scenes to document the inside story of how their supreme ambition triumphed. Ruth, a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post and deputy editor of the editorial page, has covered every major institution in Washington, including the Supreme Court, the White House, Congress, and has written about judicial confirmation battles stretching back to Robert Bork in 1987. A graduate of Yale College and Harvard Law School, she was finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Commentary in 2007. Interviewing Ruth tonight is Tom Rosenstiel. Tom is a novelist, journalist, researcher, and media critic. He is author of 10 books, including 1 NPR Book of the Year and a Washington Post bestseller. Tom is executive director of the American Press Institute and was co-founder of the Pew Research Center. He's reported for the Los Angeles Times and Newsweek. His book, The Elements of Journalism, co-authored with Bill Kovach, has been called one of the 5 best books on journalism ever written. Tom's latest book is the highly acclaimed Washington thriller, OPPO, a Novel. Welcome to the festival, Ruth and Tom.
Thanks, Phil. It's great to be here. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to have the chance to interview Ruth, who's my friend and a colleague, and someone who has written really a truly great book. Ruth, let's start by kind of setting the scene. This is not a biography of Brett Kavanaugh per se. Tell us what the book is and what you were trying to accomplish.
Well, I was trying to accomplish 3 things. One was to tell people a little bit more about who Brett Kavanaugh is and to tell his life story, because we didn't really pay a lot of attention to who he was until the Christine Blasey Ford allegations exploded on the scene. So I did want to do a little bit of biography. So you get a sense of that. He grew up right here, a local young man, grew up actually down Massachusetts Avenue from where I live. So a little bit of who's Brett Kavanaugh. A lot, and I think the funnest part really is what happened behind the scenes of his selection, because that was much more complicated, momentous, and full of drama than even we realized at the time. Behind the scenes of his selection and of his confirmation, especially after the troubles arose. And third, and maybe most important, is how his selection and confirmation fits into a 30-year struggle for conservative dominance on the court, a struggle that conservatives had but failed to achieve, as they didn't see Robert Bork confirmed in 1987, as they were frustrated and disappointed by some other Republican nominees, including David Souter and Anthony Kennedy, the justice who Brett Kavanaugh replaced, and how they finally created the legal and financial and intellectual and political architecture to make sure that this wasn't going to happen again, and how whatever it took, they were going to assemble with Justice Kennedy's retirement finally the 5-justice conservative majority on the Supreme Court.
So it reads like a thriller, and I think it was The Guardian, I can't remember who, called it a rollicking good read. And
it might have been the New York Times.
Might have been the New York Times. That's an American newspaper. But I think the question, and we're going to dig into a bunch of things, but I think one question that people have and had at the time and even now is what happened behind the scenes for the Senate to have moved in such a truncated way to probe the accusations that Christine Blasey Ford brought. Why investigate them at all if they were going to do it in such a limited way? And did they consider just abandoning Kavanaugh and picking someone else? What was going on? What did you find?
Well, the way to understand what was going on is to understand the 30 years judicial nominations wars that came before, which is Kavanaugh, by the time these allegations arose, was too big to fail. It was too close to the election. The risk of Republicans not retaining control of the Senate was too great. The stakes, because Supreme Court nominations are extremely important and extremely motivating to Republican voters. So there was a worry not just that if Kavanaugh's name were withdrawn, not only would Republicans lose the Senate because Republican voters would be so demoralized, but that it would really threaten President Trump's chances of re-election. It really feels like ancient history now, but that was definitely the worry at the time. Nobody imagined we would be in this virtual book circumstance. And thank you, by the way, Gaithersburg Book Festival, for doing this virtually, because it's, anytime I get to see anybody on Zoom who I'm not seeing all day long, I really appreciate. And so by this moment of the Christine Blasey Ford allegations exploding, Brett Kavanaugh was too big to fail. And the first urge of the White House counsel, Don McGahn, and the first urge of the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, was get it through. All they needed was 50 votes. They only needed to count to 50. And because with 50, they would have, of course, with a tie vote, Vice President Pence to break the tie. Never been that close for a Supreme Court nominee before, but that was what they needed. So their plan was, we're not going to investigate. We're not going to have any hearings. Let's just muscle it forward. And the reason, and the only reason, that they had first hearings and second an investigation such as it was that was what was required to get him across the finish line. And the investigation, as you suggested, and we can talk about this a little bit more, was not a search for the truth. It was a search for 50 votes. So they were willing to investigate and interview only as many people as the core set of wavering Republican senators and one wavering Democratic senator demanded. These were Senators Flake, McConnell.
Tell us a little bit more about that. Who were those senators, and what were their demands, and why was it that they didn't want to know the truth or weren't demanding more?
Well, I'm going to try not to get too far inside individual people's heads, but I think one thing that you need to understand about the dynamics, especially of the Senate in general, and particularly of Senate Republicans, is the peer pressure that comes to bear on individual senators. They're grown-ups, they're elected officials, they've had distinguished careers before they got to the Senate. But it's also correct, I think, and tell me if you agree with this or disagree, to understand the Senate as like a little bit of a junior high school lunchroom. You don't want to cause trouble. You want your peers to like you. You don't want to be unpopular with them. You don't want to be the person who's always causing them difficulty. So for a Susan Collins of Maine, or a Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, or Jeff Flake of Arizona, those were the main people who were wavering on the Republican side. It really takes, and people are going to be upset with this word because they will understand that there was not a lot of courage necessarily shown at the end. But even to stand up and say, whoa, wait 1 minute, we can't go ahead with this without even a little bit of investigation, does take a good deal of courage. And I want to describe actually one scene that I tell in the book that's one of my favorite scenes. And this is what happened the day that the Senate Judiciary Committee, this is after the Christine Blasey Ford hearings, Jeff Flake is confronted in the elevator, people may remember, by two tearful women who say he needs to stop this. He needs to at least have an investigation. He's agonized that night. He told me about how it was the most sleepless night of his life in the Senate. He wakes up in that morning. He decides he says he's going to vote for Brett Kavanaugh to be confirmed. His very good friend across the aisle, Chris Coons of Delaware, has been working on him for days, trying to convince him to slow down, trying to convince him at least to consider an investigation. And after this elevator incident, Chris Coons makes an impassioned plea. He's sitting across the dais from Jeff Flake, makes an impassioned plea that's directed towards him. Jeff Flake gets up from the dais, taps Coons on the shoulder, says, "We need to talk." Coons thinks that Flake is just going to tell him, "Forget it, I can't be with you." But actually, he's open to the notion, and they've been having these conversations, the four of them, Flake, Murkowski, Collins, behind the scenes about doing this. And they're crammed into this narrow corridor in the anteroom off the Senate Judiciary Committee. And Republican senators, as they realize what's going on, start to pile into this narrow hallway, and they are surrounding Flake, and Democrats are coming in there and surrounding Flake. And he finally says, "Stop, go away. I only want to talk to him." And at one point, he and Chris Coons get inside this old-fashioned phone booth so they can call the FBI director and eventually the deputy attorney general to figure out what an investigation might look like and what they could do.
Two of them in one phone booth.
In one, it's a largish phone booth. That wasn't actually the weirdest moment that happened in that room, by the way, because the weirdest moment that happened in that room involved, and this is like a scene, by the way, from the Marx Brothers Night at the Opera, I think, where they're all jammed in there and the staff is jammed in there. And at one point, the senators are all in this hallway, and there's a larger room adjacent to it. And Senator Feinstein, the ranking Democrat, says, "Staff, get out," so because the senators could have more room. But a few weeks before that, when the Christine Blasey Ford story both broke, after the a meeting of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Feinstein, the ranking Democrat, asked her colleague, the chairman of the committee at the time, Chuck Grassley of Iowa, if she could speak to him. And she motioned him, and I'm not making this up, into a bathroom, this institutional bathroom. It actually does look like a middle school faculty bathroom. And she's in there, Grassley's in there, their two top aides are in there. They close the door, and this is the first time she tells him that there is this allegation against Brett Kavanaugh in the bathroom. I have the pictures, not of their meeting, but of the bathroom.
So let's just go there for a second, because she had that allegation for a long time. How long was that, and why did she hang on to it and not tell anyone? What happened there?
Well, she had that, Christine Blasey Ford, as Brett Kavanaugh was talked about as being on the list, started to try to figure out how she could get information that she thought senators should have to the Senate. And she started trying to do this before Brett Kavanaugh was nominated. She reached out to her local congresswoman, Anna Eshoo, and eventually Anna Eshoo reached out to her, called her back, and met with her right after Brett Kavanaugh was selected. So too late to, she sort of had this slightly naive idea that maybe she could nip it in the bud if she only could let the White House counsel know there was this problem. And so Christine Blasey Ford in late July finally connects with Senator Feinstein, though she's been trying to reach her for about 3 or 4 weeks prior to that. And she gets this early July. And so she writes Anna Eshoo calls Dianne Feinstein, says, I have this constituent. She has this allegation. Senator Feinstein says, that's very serious. Have her write me a letter. And 10 days pass until Christine Blasey Ford hears back from Eshoo's office that she should write a letter. She immediately writes a letter, but she puts Senator Feinstein in a quite difficult position. She says, I don't want to come forward with this publicly. And Senator Feinstein, who had been elected to the Senate in the aftermath of the precursor to the Kavanaugh episode, which was the hearings involving Justice Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, which I also covered. Senator Feinstein says, I will not go public with this without it's your agency, it's within your control, you get to decide. But she's sitting there on this very explosive information. If there's one lesson from the Thomas hearings and the Thomas episode, it's that something like this is going to leak eventually. Senator Feinstein kind of waits over the summer to see whether Christine Blasey Ford is going to decide whether to come forward. But as she waits, she never shares this information with her colleagues, not just her colleagues on the Judiciary Committee, but she never goes to Chuck Schumer, the Senate Democratic leader, Dick Durbin, the whip, who is also a member of the Judiciary Committee, and says, I have this really knotty issue. She just decides on her own not to go public with it. And when her colleagues eventually discover this, they have a quite explosive meeting after the allegations start to leak out in late September, after the first round of hearings is complete with Justice Kavanaugh, and they really kind of want to rip her limb from limb.
And what was her explanation? What was the reason she gave for not, I mean, there's a big difference between not telling any colleagues and not going public.
She felt like her word to I should say, though I interviewed a lot of people around Senator Feinstein, I did not interview Senator Feinstein herself because her staff offered the opportunity to submit written questions, and I didn't think that was going to really work.
Right.
But the explanation that I was given was that she felt that it was Christine Blasey Ford's story to decide whether to tell or not tell, and it was not up to her to share that with anybody once she had given her word on that. I think that anybody who had lived through the Thomas hearings would have known that it was going to end almost exactly the way it did.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm going to ask you the $10 million question about Christine Blasey Ford's accusations in a minute, but let's go to that question of sources. Obviously, without identifying any of the sources that wanted to remain anonymous, to what degree did people who were backing Kavanaugh, people in the administration and inside the conservative movement, agree to talk to you for the book? Talk a little bit about how people start to react when they know someone's writing a book.
Well, it's funny. You should talk a little bit about your experience writing a novel, because your experience writing a novel is that people kind of open up a little more.
Yeah.
And people for this book, I would like to say I had that novelistic experience, but it didn't quite work out that way. In my day job, I oversee the op-ed pages of the Washington Post, and what I tell the editors I work with is, don't ask, don't get. But what I learned writing the book is that actually needs to have a book writing corollary, which is don't ask 10 times, don't get. I knocked on a lot of doors, and I called a lot of people, and I importuned a lot of people, and some of them talked and some of them didn't talk, but I was able to, I thought, and I hope readers can judge for themselves, put together the story well enough to be able to give you a you are there sense of it. I will tell one story about don't ask, don't get 10 times. At the very beginning of launching the book, I knew that one of the people I very, very, very much wanted to talk to was Senator Collins, because she was such a central figure. As people will recall, she hadn't decided and ultimately decided to vote to confirm Brett Kavanaugh. And she told me early on that she wouldn't talk to me, that she wasn't, she said, talking to anybody who did the book. And towards the end of the reporting process, I discovered that Senator Coons from Delaware, what happened was that after he convinced Jeff Flake to go along with the investigation, he was trying to get that investigation to be a real investigation. And he wanted help from his Republican colleagues to convince the White House to interview one key source, a man named Max Stier, who is a public interest person in Washington, but more to the point had been a college classmate of Brett Kavanaugh, as they had been in the same dorm as freshmen. And he had a very distinct memory that he told people about of seeing Brett Kavanaugh expose himself to a woman named Debbie Ramirez, who had come forward after Christine Blasey Ford with a story about Brett Kavanaugh, or her recollection of Brett Kavanaugh exposing himself. So Max Stier's recollection of seeing a different but quite similar incident was something that Chris Coons thought was extremely pertinent to an investigation. And he tried to get Senator Flake, and he tried to get Senator Murkowski, and he tried to get Senator Collins to press the White House to expand the investigation to include Max Stier. He sent an email to Senator Collins telling her about this and saying that, and Senator Collins knew Max Stier is quite well-known person in town, quite well thought of, quite bipartisan. And he never heard back from Senator Collins. So after having been turned down by Senator Collins' office and numerous times, I reached back out to her and sent an email to her communications director and said, well, you guys haven't been talking to me, but I do have a question about this email that she didn't respond to about Max Stier from Senator Coons. And it was then that I actually got a response that said, wait, she's going to want to talk to you. And it turned out that that email that Senator Coons had sent went to the wrong email address for Senator Collins. She had to change her email in the middle of all of this because it had gotten publicly revealed. She sent a message to senators explaining that it had been revealed and here's my new email, but Coons used the old email. But the great thing was that it got Collins on the phone with me. We probably talked for about an hour and a half, sitting in this very room. And she just told me the most compelling stories, which I then used for the book, about what it was like on the Senate floor that day as Senator Murkowski came in and sat next to Senator Collins, because they're very good friends. They sit together in the Senate. Senator Murkowski leaned over to Senator Collins and said, I can't be with you. And because she knew Senator Collins had called her that morning to say she was going to vote to confirm Kavanaugh, Senator Collins misheard her and said, I'm so relieved. And Senator Murkowski said, no, you've got it wrong. I'm going to vote against him. So you have to keep going back to those sources, Tom. You might want to put that in those principles of journalism.
Yeah, so you can, for those of you out there, you can just see what a human story this is. And these events that we think are, ideological and strictly political, that's what makes this book so fun to read. And the Collins incident was excerpted in the Washington Post. So some of you may have already read that if you haven't read the book yet. Okay, let's get to some of these other things. I mean, I think that one thing that a lot of people may be wondering is, what do you think of? Do you think he did it? Do you think he did what Ford accused him of? What's your take on all of that? And to some degree, you leave that for the end of the book.
I do. I leave it for the end of the book because while I'm an opinion columnist now, I started my career in the newsroom as a news reporter, and I really, really, really believe that what I wanted to do in this book was to go back to my reporting roots, to tell the story as best and as compellingly as I could, fully as I could tell it, and to give people enough of the facts to make the decision for themselves. So throughout the process of writing this book, my editor, I kept sending her chapters, and she kept saying to me, well, okay, this is good, but I want to know, what does Ruth Marcus think? What does Ruth Marcus think? And I kept saying, well, I think people can really judge for themselves. So finally, we were, my family was out in Wyoming last August at the very end of towards the end of the writing process. And I was out to dinner with my 20-something daughters, my husband, and I said, so do you guys think I should say whether I think he did it or not? And they were like, are you kidding? You cannot write this whole book and not tell people what you think. So I think my editor wanted to send them flowers and I did.
They were right.
Right. Yeah, they were right, as they almost always are. And my editor definitely always is. So here's what I think. It's a little complicated. I do think that all the evidence, though it is difficult and murky and not definitive, I do think the evidence suggests that he did it. I don't think that Christine Blasey Ford had motive to come forward against him. In fact, I spent quite a bit of time with her and found her to be both credible and really her life was turned inside out by this. She's a person who is nervous when she gets up to talk in front of her statistics class at the start of every semester. She does not want the limelight. She did not want to have to do this. The evidence is mixed, as you would expect the evidence to be in an episode that happened 27 years earlier. But while I think he did it, I simultaneously think that he doesn't believe that he did it. I think he doesn't remember it. I think that he was probably extremely intoxicated. I think that for him, it was, for her, it was a searing and scary episode where she felt like she was really endangered, and certainly endangered of being seriously sexually assaulted if she didn't get him off of her. I think for him, it was some drunken high school hijinks. So that's kind of where I come down. The question is, if it was just a question of is an episode like this disqualifying for somebody to be on the Supreme Court? Can we only get as far as our worst high school selves allow us to get? I think that's a really, really difficult question. For me, I thought that Brett Kavanaugh's behavior at the hearings, his explosion of anger, and not just anger, but partisanship and vitriol at the hearings when he was denying this, made that a much, much easier call in terms of whether or not he should have been confirmed. It was just injudicious. It was the epitome of injudicious. So he made that call easier for me in terms of my opinionated self.
Well, so that's part of his on the personal side about Kavanaugh. Let's talk about where your perception is of him ideologically or politically. How conservative is he? He was perceived as part of the conservative traditional establishment and not as conservative as some jurists. What's your take on what kind of jurist he'll be on the court? And he certainly wasn't always as conservative as he may now be. What happened, or what was his journey in terms of becoming more so?
So it's quite a fascinating journey. Brett Kavanaugh, growing up in Bethesda, Maryland, going to Mater Dei and onward to high school. Though his father was a lobbyist, though his mother was a lawyer and prosecutor and eventually a judge, talking about politics and talking about ideology was not a big thing in the Kavanaugh household. He's an only child. And they talked about sports and they played sports, and that was his childhood. He did not, in high school and then later in college at Yale, he was not, he was kind of a quiet Republican. Even through law school, his classmates at Yale Law School, which is a pretty liberal place, understood him to be a conservative, but kind of a quiet conservative, not one of the people who really piped up in class to espouse the conservative point of view. And so it really wasn't until, and he clerked for a judge who was quite a moderate Republican judge named Walter Stapleton, and eventually clerked for a much more conservative judge, Alex Kaczynski on the Ninth Circuit, who had to retire because of his own issues with sexual impropriety. And that Kaczynski clerkship really changed Brett Kavanaugh's life, and it exposed him to a new world of conservatism and a new way in which the book is called Supreme Ambitions, not just because it's about the Republican Party's ambitions, but it's about Brett Kavanaugh's own ambitions. And so that exposed, the Kaczynski clerkship exposed him to Ken Starr, who was the Solicitor General. That it helped him get his clerkship with Justice Kennedy. Then he went to work for Ken Starr when Ken Starr was the Whitewater Independent Counsel. And that was the real flowering, I think, of his partisan ideological development. He became very concerned about, critical of, really almost intemperate about in his conversations with friends and colleagues at the time, not just inside the independent counsel's office, but outside, really vitriolic about the Clintons. He did not think that they were trustworthy. He did not think that they were truth tellers. And but it launched him on this conservative Republican lawyer trajectory. But even as Justice Kennedy retired, there was a lot of concern about whether Brett Kavanaugh, among the conservatives, the most conservative of conservatives, there was a lot of concern about whether Brett Kavanaugh, in fact, was going to be conservative enough. And one of the most remarkable things that happened, and we didn't realize it at the time, was that a guy named Mike Davis, who was the chief nominations counsel for Chuck Grassley, launched really a rogue operation out of the Senate to try to torpedo Kavanaugh's nomination before he was selected, because as Davis said, he thought he was too bushy, too much like George W. Bush, too swampy, too much inside the Beltway, and too chiefy, too much like Chief Justice John Roberts, who's really conservative, by the way, but has disappointed conservatives in some of his rulings, in particular on the Affordable Care Act. So how conservative is Brett Kavanaugh? Pretty conservative, but he has not had, even as an appeals court judge, the freedom that he now has on the Supreme Court to decide what he really thinks the law is and what he really thinks the Constitution says. And within the next 6 weeks, we are going to find out a heck of a lot more about how conservative Brett Kavanaugh really is as the court decides a amazing docket full of important cases.
So let's talk about that. What's coming, and describe those cases, and what do you anticipate the court is going to do on those?
So I'm laughing because Tom's wife, who's a friend of mine, is a law school professor, and I don't think I've been asked to describe cases since I was a law student.
Just say what they are. You have to describe the legal standpoint. Oh my goodness.
Well,
we don't have that much time left.
There's just to set the stage for people, because we haven't really had enough news lately with everything that's going on. There is just an amazing slew of cases that the court is poised to decide. The status of the protection for the Dreamers, the immigrant children, whether federal law protects gay and transgender people from being fired because of their sexual orientation. A really critical abortion case that won't overturn Roe v. Wade, but will tell us a lot about how this court is disposed towards abortion rights.
Like the Louisiana case?
It's a Louisiana case. It's almost the exact same case as exact same law as a case from Texas, in which Justice Kennedy provided the fifth vote. Where will Brett Kavanaugh be? That's going to tell us more about him. But the cases we've been paying a lot of attention to recently, and that you were probably alluding to, involve the questions of whether a Manhattan district attorney and some House committees can obtain financial records from the President of the United States. And that's going to be a really interesting one in terms of views about presidential power, certainly from somebody who spent a lot of time investigating one president and getting records from one president and seeing what how it looks to decide about what this current president has to turn over.
And do you anticipate that there'll be any deviation, or do you think these are all going to be 5-4 votes, basically for the conservative side and for Trump?
I think that almost all of I don't want to get too far out on a limb here because I'm about to be proved wrong and it'll be, forever on video. I do think it's entirely possible that the court could split the difference here, that you could imagine a 5-4 vote or something very close to that, disallowing the congressional subpoenas, but a vote that goes the other way, upholding the subpoenas from the Manhattan district attorney.
Okay, I'm not a lawyer, so I won't try and parse that, but so just, you mentioned John Roberts, and you said he's very conservative. I know a friend of his, another judge, who said John Roberts was staring down the prospect that he would spend the rest of his career on the court writing dissents if Antonin Scalia's successor, Merrick Garland, or another Democrat had been appointed and Hillary Clinton won the election. He now has a one-judge majority in terms of conservative versus liberal. He really wants another. So he actually very much wants Trump to be reelected, so that the chances are that he'll have a lot of cushion. Do you think that's oversimplistic? How much of an institutionalist is he, and how much of a conservative is he? I mean, these are obviously oversimplifications, but.
So he's both. He's simultaneously a conservative and an institutionalist. And what we mean when we talk about him as an institutionalist is he does not want to see the court diminish itself in the public estimation. He understands that the legitimacy of the court really stems from its respectability. And once it's perceived as yet another partisan institution, it loses that veneer and loses its power. And yet he is also a conservative, and he is inclined to vote with conservatives in almost every instance. It'll be really fascinating to see how he treats, for example, this Louisiana abortion case that we talked about, because he voted to the court as a whole, with the help of Justice Kennedy, struck down the Texas law, but Justice Roberts voted to uphold the Texas law. Will he switch in this case because the court has essentially already decided this case, and it would just look so partisan and opportunistic if he changed? Or how will that go? I do think it's a really interesting question that I haven't really thought about whether John Roberts is rooting for another Trump term. Very possibly, because it's uncomfortable to be deciding these cases by a 5-4 vote. I've always thought that if the court, for example, were going to overrule Roe, it will never happen by a 5-4 vote. Roe, it's almost impossible to imagine this now, but Roe was originally decided by a 7-2 vote. And one of the two dissenters was a Democratic appointee, Byron White. But the court, if Roe's overruled, isn't going to do it by 5-4. It'll do it by 6-3 or more than that. And in order for that to happen, John Roberts is going to need reinforcements.
So,
which I hope he doesn't get.
So what do you hear? Let's kind of move forward to the pandemic. What do you hear from the Republican sources that you talk to about how they view the administration? You know, we know what people say on camera. And you and I have talked about how we used to hear as journalists a lot more from, I think, sources privately. We knew a lot about what they would let their hair down with journalists, I think, much more than they do now. But you are a columnist, and you might get more of that than a beat reporter, or than you did when you were a beat reporter. What is your sense of Republicans in this town and their view of the administration's handling of the pandemic?
I have not talked to any Republican senator who thinks that the handling of the pandemic has been exemplary, except for an example of how not to do it. I mean, it's clear that the president didn't respond aggressively, didn't respond early. We've been quarantining, everybody's been quarantining. For what? Where's the testing strategy? I think that there are moments when I feel a real sense of pity for Republican senators who have to watch things like President Trump suggest that we should be drinking bleach or, shining light or taking unproven and disproven medicines for ourselves, and have to figure out ways to defend him, and they just generally don't. But the reality here is that they like their majority and they like their judges, and more than that, they fear their base. So that if they start to say anything that goes against their voters, Trump is angry at Twitter right now, I've heard. But boy, Twitter is his megaphone, and he unleashes those Twitter mobs on Republican lawmakers that he doesn't like. And ask Jeff Flake how that works out. Jeff Flake decided not to run for another term because he knew he was going to lose because he had crossed Donald Trump. And that's the reality of life in Washington today.
Yeah. Well, I hope we have some questions. I have a couple more. One thing that I want to ask you is, it's been about 8 or 9 months since you finished the book, roughly. Is there anything, and this always happens, and you'll have the paperback coming out, but is there anything you would do differently? Any shading that would be different in retrospect, things that you've learned since then, or a call you make? I mean, in a book like this, because it's a book and because it's supposed to have, it's more of an historical document, you have to kind of come down on sides. Whereas if you were just a daily reporter, you'd say, well, we'll wait till tomorrow. Today's the best obtainable version of the truth today, but I'm going to have more shots at it. Is there anything here where you'd say, in retrospect, I would have leaned a different way, or I think I've learned something subsequent that I didn't know? So,
not yet. It's funny, when I ended up writing that final unintended chapter, I came down actually precisely where I had been during the confirmation process, which is there is a real risk of injustice either way. If I'm wrong and the evidence is not definitive and Christine Blasey Ford's story is mistaken somehow, terrible injustice would have been done to Brett Kavanaugh if he hadn't been confirmed, and a terrible injustice would have been done to Brett Kavanaugh even with his confirmation, putting him through this unfair ordeal. And yet there are risks on the other side. And in the end, I thought at the time of the confirmation, and I still think now, that the question is, who should bear the burden of that risk? Should it be Brett Kavanaugh because because it's not, it's certainly not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, not even close to that. Or do you give the benefit of the doubt, as Senator Byrd suggested back in the days of Clarence Thomas? Does the benefit of the doubt go to the court and the institution? That's where I would put it. I still come out in the same way. The question that I think is interesting that the next several weeks will help us understand is whether the confirmation process and the grueling, searing nature of that confirmation process, what impact that had on Brett Kavanaugh. He talked to his friends afterwards and said he was bound and determined to be the same justice he would have been had Christine Blasey Ford never surfaced. Mm-hmm. But it's a scarring experience. And we saw in the experience of Justice Thomas that it was very embittering for him. It did change the way he looked at the world. And I think it took somebody who was always going to be a conservative justice and moved him even more into the conservative end zone of the court. That's not where Brett Kavanaugh emerged in his first term on the court, but this term is much more dramatic. It's got many more dramatic cases. He's gotten his sea legs. We will find out whether Mike Davis, we'll find out to some extent whether Mike Davis was right in thinking that he was too bushy, too chiefy, too swampy. We'll find out to some extent how that confirmation process impacted his jurisprudence, if it did. So I would say I'm looking at the pages to decide whether there's anything I want to change for the paperback, and not yet, but I really do want some opportunity to elaborate on the next to final chapter and to talk about his beginnings on the court and talk about how he is manifesting his jurisprudence.
I will say this, that when I wrote my first novel, which is called Shining City and is about a Supreme Court nomination. And
it's really fun, guys. You really, they're just real. If anybody's sitting at home and has gone through all of Netflix and all of Hulu and all of Amazon Prime, go read Tom Rosenstiel's 3 books.
Thank you, Ruth. But as I was doing the research, so one of probably the preeminent Republican judge veteran in the country said, what we've learned about Supreme Court nominations, they said it's the most cynical activity in Washington. And the only way you can lose is by answering a question fully. Which is, and so these are not educations on the Constitution when these hearings happen. Phil, do we have some questions? I've got more for Ruth, but if you've got some for us.
We certainly do, and I want to thank you both. That was magnificent. And Ruth, most specifically, I have to thank you because I'm now forever going to be thinking of the Senate as a junior high school lunchroom.
Yeah.
Lovely way to put it.
Yeah. That and a search for 50 votes, not for the truth, kind of tells you everything you need.
Great. Well, all right, we do have some questions for you. So up first, we have a question from Megan Wassell. She says, it is interesting how Ruth points out that the 30 years leading up to Kavanaugh's nomination laid the groundwork for it. How long do you think his confirmation will affect the court, and in what ways?
Well, Justice Brennan, liberal lion of the Supreme Court, used to say that the most important thing to understand about being a Supreme Court justice was how to count to 5. He called it the rule of 5. Justice Kavanaugh is 53, maybe he's turned 54. Young, that means he is going to be on the court for 20, 30 more years, unless something happens or decides to leave, and which I don't think either one of those things will happen. And so he and his jurisprudence are going to shape the court for years to come. And that is why, one of the many reasons why I think this coming election is so critical, because we think of it and we talk about it in terms of, and this is me as my opinion writer self, we talk about it as 4 more years of Trump, but that's not that only scratches the surface of what it is. If President Trump were reelected, we have an 86-year-old Justice Ginsburg. We have an 80 or 81-year-old Justice Breyer. If the conservative justices want to retire, they will be replaced by equally conservative justices, though it would be quite a trick to replace Justice Thomas with somebody more conservative than him. So electing President Trump to a second term isn't just 4 more years of Trump, it's about 30 more years of conservatives' domination of the court.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, up next we've got here, what were some of the similarities and differences in covering the confirmation hearings of Justice Thomas and Justice Kavanaugh?
Well, thank you for asking, because the biggest difference was, I think I can say this, I met my husband during the Clarence Thomas hearings. He was working for a Democratic senator at the time, and we did not start dating until well after the confirmation. But it was a kind of defining moment of my life for many reasons. More seriously, the difference between the Thomas nomination and the Kavanaugh nomination, even though they came out with the same end result, both were confirmed, really fascinating. On the one hand, the investigation of Justice Thomas was a more serious investigation. I would say that the weight of the evidence involving Justice Thomas was actually significantly stronger than the weight of the evidence involving Justice Kavanaugh. But the biggest and most fascinating difference was, and even though people my daughter's age watched the Kavanaugh hearings and were appalled at what they saw, for me, I had watched an all-male Senate Judiciary Committee, not a single woman, with Democrats who did not take Anita Hill's side, but sort of cast themselves as impartial arbiters of the truth, and Republican senators who were prosecutorial in their zeal to take her apart and just did not understand the nuances and realities of women in the workplace and women dealing with issues of sexual harassment. So for me, that Senate Judiciary Committee versus the new Senate Judiciary Committee, where there were still no women among the Republican senators, but there were, I think, 4 women among the Democrats. The Republicans were scared out of their wits, and for good reason, of repeating the experience of the Anita Hill hearings and looking like they were being unfair to or disrespectful to Christine Blasey Ford. So I thought, though the results might have been similarly disappointing, I was, and the investigation was just an abomination, and I call it in the book a dereliction of duty. I thought that in terms of where the country has moved on gender, I was a little bit more glass half full than some people who hadn't lived through that earlier experience.
All right. After spending so much time with Christine Blasey Ford and covering Anita Hill, would you say to other women contemplating whether or not or how to come forward with their own allegations, what is it you would say to them?
Wow.
Oh, great questions, Phil.
Great question. Well, there is a woman who is in the book and is also a friend of Tom's and mine named Ricky Seidman, who worked in the Senate and was one of the Senate aides who was instrumental in persuading Anita Hill to come forward. And she was retained. She's now a public relations expert in an outside firm. And Christine Blasey Ford's lawyers, before she decided to come public, brought her in. And she had, Ricky Seidman, having been really seared by the Anita Hill experience and feeling the weight of how that transformed and upended Anita Hill's life, spent a lot of time talking to Christine Blasey Ford about whether or not to come forward, and advised her that she didn't think it was going to make a difference in the outcome. And did Christine Blasey Ford really want to do this to herself? Did she really want to do this to her family? And so when I hear that question, I think, what would Ricky say in answer to that question? And you have to understand, and it was brutal and vicious. The attacks on Anita Hill were unbelievable. She was a little bit nutty and a little bit slutty. She was, I'm not saying this is what the attack was. She was suffering, her critics said, from erotomania. So she had made up in her mind this episodes with Justice Thomas that never happened. So it's not like things weren't terrible then, but with the advent of the internet and the megaphone of Twitter and everything else, it should be, it has to be, you'd have to tell somebody, if you had their best interests at heart, what a ringer they are about to put themselves through if they were to come forward with testimony like Anita Hill had or like Christine Blasey Ford had.
Yes. All right, we've got one here from Jean, who says, Ruth, you mentioned the Thomas hearing, but weren't the Bork hearings the start of his current high court nominee drama?
Indeed, and these are great questions, and thank you so much. The Bork hearings, and by the way, as the Bork hearings were going on, I was covering them. Justice Kavanaugh was in his first semester at Yale Law School, and while Judge Bork had taught at Yale Law School, so it was a big topic of conversation at Yale. Nobody really remembers Brett Kavanaugh talking about it a lot, but Bork was the defining moment for the conservative legal movement. It was, that was the time when they were outgunned, outmaneuvered, outspun, and outspent by liberals. And for them, it was a never again moment. They were not going to allow that to happen. And it was after that that they, with the work of the Federalist Society, built, as I said earlier, the financial and intellectual and legal architecture to vet and create and promote and groom and ultimately to confirm these nominees. And they were, and it was kind of one of those Scarlett O'Hara, as God is my witness, we're never gonna lose a Supreme Court nomination again moments for them.
The next question for you comes from our Mayor Judd. Ruth, what's the most—
Hi, Mayor.
What's the most challenging aspect of running the Washington Post op-ed page?
The most challenging aspect is, and this part has gotten, I was sounding a little critical of the internet, so I'm now going to say something nice. We have now actually 2 physical op-ed pages, which is incredibly fantastic, especially in an era when print news is declining. But we have more space to put columns in print. But we also have the benefit of being able to accept even more op-eds for publication online than we can fit into print. So the hardest part is actually still nonetheless deciding what pieces to accept and what pieces to reject. But the good news is that we have this incredibly full menu, so that if you look at our print selections and you go online, you will find even more amazing things to read. But that's the hardest part, is saying no, including saying no to your friends.
Mm-hmm. And you had a little friend just wander in there.
Oh, my dog came in?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's Tank.
That's hi, Tank. All right, we've got our last question for you. This one comes from Nancy Redding. Are you working on another book at this time?
So my husband and I were driving someplace about 2 months after the book came out, and I said, I think I'd like to write another book, and you have never seen a human being blanch like he did. He was like, no, not that soon. I am maybe a little bit following in Tom's footsteps and playing around with a novel. And I would very much like to write another nonfiction book. I really, really, really enjoyed the process of being able to write in chunks that were longer than 800 words, which is about the length of a column. But I need to find the right, for me, the Kavanaugh confirmation was something I had been really preparing to write my whole career. I had covered Bork, I had covered Thomas. Here, I had met Brett Kavanaugh when he worked for Judge Starr in the White House. He had come to a White House Correspondents' Dinner with me. So this was the book that I was meant to write. And I just am looking for the next one that I am meant to write. But if my husband has his way, it won't happen too soon.
You can tell John that the second one is easier than the
And they keep getting easier, do you think, Tom?
Yes, I think they do. You do learn a few things, although subject matter makes a difference. I will say, Ruth, novels are harder. Novels are definitely harder.
Well, why? How?
Because there's no reality to to follow. You're not unearthing something; you're imagining it. And I don't know. Maybe you've got more imagination than I do, but
I doubt that.
Set up every morning and think, what is this person who I invented gonna do? One thing that Ruth did mention is that when you interview people for novels, they suddenly open up in ways that they never did when you were journalists. Partly because I think you ask them questions that they've not thought about, like what did it feel like when you were doing that, when this thing happened. Reporters don't ask people, how did you feel internally about that? They just want to know what happened. So people start to open up because they thought, oh, I've never really thought about that. Plus, you're not going to name them, and they get to be a character in a book, which I think we've all kind of wanted to do. Let me just say one last thing, which is there's an old saying that journalism should be the plumb line, telling us, kind of what's true north or what's a straight line on things. To do that, you have to have an open mind and humility. And I think Ruth has those qualities much more than most journalists. And I think it comes out in the stories, the vividness and the humanity of this book. I mean, if you're listening, you will love this book. You should buy it.
The check is in the Venmo.
Ruth and Tom, what a privilege it was to have both of you with us tonight. Thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Thank you, guys.
A lot of fun.
And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this in-depth interview. I'm certain you'd enjoy owning your very own copy of this book. To do this, visit Politics and Prose, where you can order your copy online right now. Simply click on the link in the description box we provided below. On the Hot Stove, fans of psychological thrillers, join us tomorrow night at 7 p.m. for a conversation with best-selling authors Sarah Pekkanen and Kate White as they talk about their new suspense novels, You Are Not Alone and Have You Seen Me? Then, on Sunday morning at 11 a.m., tune in with the kids for some drawing fun with best-selling author Tom Engelberger, creator of Origami Yoda and Dee Dodo, the Future Spy series. In the meantime, take a look around the GBF YouTube channel and the festival website at Gaithersburgbookfestival.org to discover all the other amazing programs coming your way. Okay, I wish all of you the very best. I've been your VGBF host, Phil Kaminsky. Have a terrific